seconds. All right, welcome to this live stream. Really happy to be hosting Brennan Graham Dempsey, if I pronounce his name correctly, hopefully. We had this interesting post that he did in his group where he posted something that talked about the need for like secular monasteries in this new age. And it just so happened that he was also on a series about creating this religion that is not a religion. And I happened to had gotten a grant in the past for like reimagining the monastery. So I thought it was a good idea to have a little chat about it. And I want to start off by potentially allowing Brendan to talk a bit about himself and what excites him about this particular topic of the future of the monastery.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me. This is fun. Yeah. So let me think. I hear myself a little echo in the back, so I'll try to just. Well, I know what I'll do. I'll take this out. So my background with this material is pretty long, so I won't get into all of that necessarily. But the post that you reference was a thing I shared written by Hansi Freinock, the meta-modern philosopher, through the Meta Moderna hub. And it was a piece that talked about the idea of having secular monasteries for as part of something that we do culturally, that we bring into the way that we live our lives. I think it begins with sort of the radical and wonderful idea that everyone should be allowed off a year to just, like once in their life, to just go to a monastery and figure stuff out, get a new direction if need be, get some self-exploratory opportunities to grow individually and develop, work with a gamut of spiritual practitioners and therapists, and basically a sort of how would you put it, a kind of secular spiritual set of guides or something like that, that can help people navigate a world that requires essentially a lot more of us. And so that was sort of the initial, I think, what's the word, kind of the catalyst for this conversation. And it was exciting to see Hansi post that. I'm pretty active in the metamodern community and run that group that you mentioned called Metamodern Spirituality. It was exciting because synchronously, contemporaneously, I've been working on kind of building up a retreat center here in Vermont, where I basically plan to, as much as possible, do that sort of a thing here, or create the opportunities here for that sort of a thing. It's a spiritual retreat center. It's a venue where people can come and be in nature, and it's located on 120 acres of really beautiful Vermont land with ponds and everything. And so in this new kind of position that I'm in here, I would love to try to use this space as a kind of proof of concept prototypes to see if something like that were interesting to people and workable. So I'm sort of working out the mechanics of some of that, trying to organize and host events. But I suspect we'll get into this a bit more, but trying to also just sort of figure out the infrastructure. And we can talk a lot more about that. I think the infrastructure, the institutional dynamics are something that is a really interesting question to me, something I've explored a little bit with Bruce Alderman, and I know Layman Pascal and others have been interested in. I know, well, anyway, we can get into all that, but that was sort of the immediate catalyst. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear more about how that kind of like connected with that religion that is not a religion. Do you think basically that maybe like what you end up kind of like constructing can be used back into those like new kind of monasteries?
Yeah. So that's a great question, right? So the whole religion that's not a religion thing is a sort of a highly related and yet also independent track, which there's a lot of convergence and consilience on. And that project comes specifically out of the work of John Vervaeke, whose wonderful Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series has been incredibly popular and increasingly influential. And a lot of people are tuning in and waking up to that. And so one of the things that John articulates is the need in our current society for something like a set of practices that how would I put this? He argues for the need of an ecology of practices that would fulfill something like the role that religions used to provide in terms of cultivating wisdom, and learning the skills and practices that are crucial, probably now more than ever, for sense making, meaning making, and kind of positioning ourselves and understanding the world. So obviously, there's both a concern about traditional religion as to whether or not that is in our current moment up for that job, whether that's possible for traditional religious um, uh, you know systems to be able to handle and facilitate. um, there's a lot of reason, and John talks about this, the rise of the so-called nones, Nones, those who don't identify with any particular given religious tradition, and which is now actually the fastest growing, and I believe is now the most popular religious affiliation, at least in the United States. And if it's the case here, then I'm sure it's all the more so in other parts of the world, um, especially Europe. So I say that because there's an ambivalence, to put it mildly, about the traditional religious systems and how people view them, what they're able to achieve and facilitate in terms of genuine growth and development these days, and situation for making sense and meaning in the world. And John ties that to, and I think he's right, the way that those traditional systems tend to work within a sort of um, two worlds mythology, right? If you go back to the axial age and you see where these systems come from, despite many differences, many very important differences, there's a lot of shared resonance around the idea that, well, we live in this world, but there's this other world. And in some ways, the religious task, is to sort of get out of this world. And that sort of viewpoint has, I think, rightly been very undermined in the past 500 years, and especially within the last 50 or so, and through the transitions through modernity and into post-modernity, that now I think something like a two worlds mythology is one of the biggest barriers for why people, one of the biggest barriers for the traditional religious systems for folks. And so I think that there's a need and an interest in trying to articulate spiritual identities and spiritual frameworks that are more in line with sort of the ontology that our sort of best science can give us, that our current understanding of the world has afforded us, when you compare it especially to the understandings of the way the world worked, say, when the axial age religions were developed. So there's this need to update religion, essentially. And so Vervaeke's religion that's not a religion is sort of speaking to that need. It's a religion insofar as it's in some ways providing, or would attempt to provide, the sorts of ecologies or practices that would be efficacious for people in these crucial, necessary, meaning-giving ways. And it's not a religion in the sense that it diverges from a lot of the old metaphysical claims and sort of buy-in presuppositions that the traditional axial age religions, and by that I mean, for clarity's sake, traditional Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox Judaism, whatever, Orthodox name your religion, and there's something about the metaphysical systems there that modernity and now post-modernity have sort of critiqued and require an update of some kind. So, the religion is not a religion is one of a couple different tracks that of folks or projects who, trying to articulate what this is, how it could be sort of instantiated in the world, implemented, how we make this a reality, which is urgently needed. And for me, I'm particularly interested in well, of course, John's project, and we've been engaged in Dialogos on this, called the artful scaling of the religion that's not a religion, and thinking about the sort of infrastructures that would be required for something like this. But I'm also interested in synergistic movements, whether that's the integral scene and Ken Wilber's notion of the religion of tomorrow. Jamie Wheel has talked about meaning 3.0, and Greg Enriquez and others, metapsychological programs and whatnot, that I think are really right there on the cutting edge of that nexus point between spiritual development and psychological development and enrichment, but also not at the expense of what we know or what we can affirm about the way the world works and our best scientific understandings of things like that. So so that I'll shut up now, and but that's sort of the context.
That was great. I made a bunch of like mental bookmarks as you were talking, especially given what I've done like in 2017 to give some people from the meta modern spirituality a shout out and a sort of answer as I'm like going deeper into what I'm about to say. I think Paul Bloch or Bloch, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, asked, have either of you lived in a traditional monastery? Have either of you lived in a modern spiritual community governed by a hierarchy or teacher? I can answer the first question, which is yes. Essentially, I went to Nepal and lived in Tibetan monasteries there, and also in Japan in Zen monasteries. In one Zen monastery, not in many. In Nepal, I did check more than one, but in Japan it was Antaiji, which is like a Soto Zen monastery. So after having that experience, I returned back to my home country, and it was actually those experiences that led me to start thinking about this topic. I kind of actually I gave a nickname to the place that I was in Greece, kind of like a monastery of one. And then at some point, when a professor from Hong Kong basically was passing through Athens, we talked about this issue, and then I got a grant to reimagine the monastery at the School of Design in Hong Kong Polytechnic. And what happened basically was me drawing for those experiences into starting to think along the lines that you mentioned, meaning, okay, you have this very big group of people that you mentioned, nuns, that are growing, but at the same time, you see that Nietzsche was right when he predicted the nihilism back in the 19th century, and there's a big need with respect to people being able to have and seek and understand and experience the divine. And I was thinking, okay, if we're gonna have these new kind of monasteries, they can't look exactly like the ones that we had before. And in my mind, I was thinking that most of the monasteries in the past were spiritually monogamous, right? And I was thinking the new ones would be spiritually polyamorous, and they include essentially many of the different spiritual traditions, including science and philosophy. And you would go in there, and they would try to work from first principles and use the different traditions to be able to essentially enlighten the very questions that anybody who cares about spirituality cares about. So that way, it would actually make it even, I would believe, easier for people who go into these places, which I named polysteries, for them to understand the question from many perspectives and use the different modalities that exist in all the different traditions to get something which I think many of the at least Western sort of like religions have moved away from, which is essentially the religious experience. I'm talking the religious experience more in the sense of the mystical experience, right? In the East, in Buddhism and other practices, you have specific like instructions on how to get there. But it seems like in Christianity, this whole idea of essentially like becoming one with the divine, even back in the 15th century, when there was this person who was a scholastic who came to Athos. I don't know if you know it. It's essentially it's an Orthodox like Vatican, right? It's still around. All these like traditional Christian Orthodox monasteries are there, and there was a particular group called the Hesychasts, right? In Greek, it means the quiet ones. Of course, this is a reference to quieting the mind. And they had particular practices that they claimed brought you to like union with God, right? And of course, when the scholastic in the 15th century heard about this, he shouted heresy, and there was a whole like synod where I think the name was like John Palamas or Saint John Palamas, like this particular like person defended them, and thankfully he won. Otherwise, those people would have been cast out as heretics. And essentially, he kept the mystical tradition in Eastern Orthodox Christianity alive rather than like casting these people out. But if you look at the other traditions, the whole idea of mysticism kind of like went underground, and it hasn't been as alive in most people. I mean, even like with like Luther, like when he said, well, you don't need the intermediary to like connect with God. You remember what happened, right? So I think that this has come back, and a lot of people are now experiencing religious experience through different festivals that they go to, through the second psychedelic renaissance that happens, through all these practices from the East that have been rediscovered since the 60s and 70s. And there seems to be this need for a place where it all comes together, and I think that like this attempt to create a place that I call like a polystery is more sort of urgent than ever, because I think that Solzhenitsyn had a very interesting idea with respect to what went wrong when with respect to the Soviet Union. And I'll read this quote, and then I'll like open it up to your comments. But it's one of my favorite quotes, and it goes a bit like this. Let me see. So he said, so for those who are unaware, Alexander Solzhenitsyn was like this great writer who lived in the Soviet Union. Like, he didn't do that well with the regime, and he ended up being sent to like gulags. He wrote the Gulag Archipelago. So he was like a lifelong critic of the Soviet Union and all the atrocities that happened there. So he said this: I have spent over 50 years working on the history of a revolution. In the process, I have read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own toward the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this happened. This is a staggering quote. And I think that it's time to essentially move to a new phase where, what Weber said about the disenchantment of the world, when he originally said in 1918, he actually said it as a warning. He didn't say it as a good thing. And I think it's time not to like re-enchant the world, right, in the sense of like bewitch them, but to actually understand that we are deeply spiritual beings and use the knowledges that we have of the practices, almost like democratize the access to them, so that people can figure it out on their own. You don't have to believe me, just do these practices. And when you have a mystical experience, you will realize that all these mystics throughout the ages were not lying. You just need to do the practices. It's not a matter of belief anymore. This is the age I think we're in. And maybe those polysteries, those new kind of monasteries, can facilitate that. I'm gonna stop now because I talked too much. So maybe hear some comments when I mute myself.
Oh yeah, I love that. Totally resonate with all of that. The idea of re-enchantment's really interesting. I agree. There's a lot of the work that I'm interested in, that in the way that I kind of frame some of it, is as a re-enchantment project. But as you say, it's not sort of a, we're trying to bring uh, fairy tales back or something, and that sort of re-enchantment, but that to reinfuse the experience of reality with significance and profundity and sublimity, which if we are spiritual beings, is going to lie at sort of the core of our reality. But everything you said, I completely second and reiterate. I would say it's interesting too, though, because that Solzhenitsyn quote that you read is intriguing, because I think there was a time when a lot of these issues were blurred, or what's the word? They were occluded in some way. They were uh, confused with certain kinds of reactionary forces, at least in American society. There were certainly people, and still are in America, saying, "Oh, the godless, heathens have all, gone astray, and because we've forgotten God as a society." But their answer was, we need, prayer back in school and things like that. And so there was sort of a sense that, if you were saying things like that, you just kind of got lumped in with that. And yet, at the same time, it's kind of important to realize that there's a kernel of truth there, even if the particular sort of prescriptions after the diagnosis aren't necessarily the most salutary ones. But I think the idea that the institutional apparatus that we live in, as sort of a holdover from modernization and the kind of factory system of everything, industrialized system for everything, including education, that we left out things like values and ethics and deep spiritual concerns, for many good reasons, in some sense, because we were trying to maintain this sort of separation of, state and sort of the allow for religious pluralism, ideally. But I think that created a void where, and I posted a piece about this a couple days ago called "The Wind," where I talk about how, there's one way of diagnosing this problem is that, we might be really advanced as a civilization cognitively. We can dance around all sorts of variables and come up with really high tech systems and incredible technological gadgets and things, but we're sort of stunted or crippled even when it comes to more fundamental human spiritual concerns. And a lot of that, arguably, is because the institutional infrastructure that we exist in, it doesn't tend to that, right? We go to school, as Vervaeke says, we know where to get knowledge, right? You get knowledge at the schools and the university, okay, but where do you get wisdom? That's what we don't have an institution for, since the decline of the monastic traditions. So I think this is important, right? Is like, how do we build up an institutional framework for for the cultivation of wisdom, or the cultivation of transcendence? Really, I think you're very right to say too, the democratization of transcendence, really, or the democratization of the mystical experience is now a possibility in a way that it never was before. And so that is a hugely exciting moment to be living in, paired also with the increased accessibility of other forms, whether it's psychotechnologies or psychedelics, that can be kind of brought into this sort of mixture of means to facilitate these sorts of experiences. The one last thing I did want to say, though, before passing the mic off again, was I love the idea of, as you put it, a polystery. I think that's a very cool one, and I like the idea of a sort of a how would I say? I think that framing it that way helps to resolve some of the difficulties that people have with something like a monastery, and we can get into that too, because I think that's really important. I think we also have to get into, well, what's wrong about the monastic tradition? Where did it fail? And I have a lot to say about that too, so as much as I know of it. And and so I think that one of the ways around some of the failures is this sort of pluralistic approach, where it's not this sort of dogmatic orthodox view, but we're going to kind of draw upon various forms of the esoteric, traditions and the perennial wisdoms in order to facilitate these experiences. I think that opens it up, and it's freer and nicer like that. What I'm particularly interested in is how do we create new mythoi and new symbolic frameworks entirely, which is maybe in some ways kind of my most radical stuff. But that's some of my thoughts. Yeah, take it away.
Okay. First of all, there's been some comments as we were talking, and I want to probably address both what you said in the beginning of your of your response, and also like some of the comments. But I agree that obviously, when we talk about bringing back sort of like what I call numinous, right? Comes from Latin. Numen means like the spiritual essential experience. I don't mean like bringing back like prayer to schools or any of those like institutional like ways of doing that. I think that's mostly performative. In some way, I think that what has been lost and what is regained is the very experiences that give people an interest that this is not just a number of fairy tales said by old people to keep us under their power, right? Because we have to accept and kind of like acknowledge that religion, organized religion for centuries has also been used as an instrument for control. And this is essentially what happened with the Enlightenment. The reason why the Enlightenment happened is because religion had such a heavy hand on the world affairs that people started basically choking. And at the same time, many of the things that were said were challenged by the advance of modern science and so forth, right? So I don't think that what we're suggesting here, and this is why I love the fact that you also have this concurrent thing of like a religion without a religion. We're not suggesting it going back. We're suggesting it going forward. So that doesn't mean kind of like not knowing what happened. And I think that generally, like in an era which I think is very like presentist in the sense of like only caring about the present and not looking back that much. That's something that we need to like stress, because if you don't look back, you will probably repeat the same mistakes, and that's a shame, right? So I do think we need to look back enough to not do that. But at the same time, and in fact, actually, that's a good segue to this comment that was written. So it's again by Paul. I'm gonna actually show it in the stream. Let's see how that works. Oh, was cool. All right. So Paul says, glad to hear you have some first-hand experience, because we mentioned that some of us have. In a monastery, in a relation with teacher, the practices are defined by the tradition and hierarchy, mostly recommended and guided by the teachers themselves. Teachers have the ability to employ any skillful means. This is not dissimilar to a therapist recommending treatments for their patients. However, spiritual modernists, like the all-you-can-eat and choose-your-own adventure model of spiritual practices. Okay, so I guess there's a problem there in how you stressed it. She talked about I guess he doesn't like that choose-your-own adventure issue, given that there's multiple problems. Today we have the rise of influencer spirituality, where people now believe they have insight or have the ability to teach after doing a single Vipassana retreat and ayahuasca ceremony. So I think that a lot of us are aware of this, and there's good and bad aspects to this. First of all, people care again. So that's on its own, I think is a positive. Whenever any new thing opens, again, there's a tendency for the lack of standards to be the rule in the beginning, right? And I understand that actually many people have potentially been harmed by this. I mean, we hear all the time, cult leaders who have had that, originally may have had some sort of spiritual experience, may have healed some sort of trauma, and they start teaching without any sort of framework, without any sort of standards. People come to them, they basically may even get some sort of benefit, from the teaching. But then the power that the teacher is given often like goes to their heads, and then like all sorts of weird abuses start occurring. So we of course would need to be careful with respect to I think what you mentioned earlier, like the idea of like institutions, but at the same time, be careful, because the more you start talking about standards, institutions, and so forth, the more easy it becomes for there to be sort of like institutional capture by the powers that be, and that then basically say, oh, these teachers, yeah, they're bad for you, like don't listen to them, right? So there's this danger that if you lean too much on the institutions and trying to have standards and so forth, you will close the horizon and potentially like drown out voices that the establishment doesn't want to hear. So that's kind of like the bad on the one side. But on the other, if you leave it too open and you don't talk about the potential bad actors, you may have people getting hurt or distorting basically the whole like field. I think that's part of the growing pains of any sort of movement or any sort of realization. I think that it just has to be talked about, and people, there should be awareness, in other words, about the issues. And I think, especially for example, like if you take like the second psychedelic renaissance we're experiencing right now, there's way more knowledge and books and articles with respect to how to safely experience and under what setting to experience those kind of like very powerful substances. So I think that it's a legitimate point and it has to be discussed, but at the same time I think there's dangers into stepping back too much to authority figures and institutions and traditions. But it is delicate. Remember that, like, there have been times when, for example, in Alexandria, Hellenistic times, where all the traditions were kind of like, in the same place. I mean, that was like syncretism, right? There was a lot of like, marriage of different traditions and so forth. And also, like, there are people who are discovering new things. So, when you begin a tradition, it's not as easy to have standards, but I think, like Paul is right, it does help to look back, as you said too, to see what went wrong, so as not to do the same mistakes, but also like to offer enough freedoms so that people have some leeway in like experimenting with these new kind of like insights that they may have. I'm gonna stop now so I can give you a chance to comment.
Yeah, I think that that's right. I think there are tendencies and trajectories that I think need to be considered and appreciated here. Um, that So I would say nothing is perfect. Nothing will ever be perfectly instituted in ways. There will always be means by which things can become perverted or distorted or what have you. And in some ways, it's those failed experiments and those failures that sort of carve out that sort of strange attractor center of showing what does work and what is right. So in some ways, you could even make an argument that the necessity of that happening is just it's sort of built into the mechanics of it all, and this is true of everything, right? I mean, we could say, oh, no one should be able to sell anything ever because then people will have look at all the abuses of our economic systems, et cetera, and right. I mean, there's a good point to be made in some ways there, but the radical solution of just getting rid of buying and selling doesn't necessarily mean the right. And you could go across the board, oh, we shouldn't have educational systems because a teacher will have this asymmetrical power relationship to the student, and that's not fair, or that could create abuses, et cetera, and yes, it does, et cetera. So you can go down the line of saying, pick any field of human endeavor, and will there be misuses, abuses, distortions? Yes. So that being said, it doesn't mean that we don't pursue these things. It just means that, okay, let's be super mindful of what those things are, so we can so that the best, most reliable and responsible actors can try to avoid them and create something still healthy. um, for me, the things that come up are, which you've raised, is the cult dynamics, which is a huge concern, especially in nascent and inchoate communities of people interested in spirituality. And you see these dynamics that they're I mean, they really they proliferate anywhere where there is a certain lack of institutional guards and rails to kind of fight those forces. So anytime there's sort of a, oh, this is a budding church, or this is a new community of people interested in getting together and doing spirituality, you got to be wary of, who are these strange charismatic figures coming in and saying things that sound pretty good, and they assert themselves as being particularly enlightened and having had some wonderful experiences, and maybe they're super developed. I mean, this is a whole thing in the metamodern community, which focuses, or has a focus on developmental psychology, and there are cult-like dynamics of people who want to put themselves forward as being the top dog, and I'm cross paradigmatic and things like that. So there's cult dynamics. That's a danger. And so, but here's the challenge, right? This becomes a finding a sweet spot, because what the guard against the cult dynamics, or what can kind of put a kibosh on that, is when you have strong institutional frameworks that can have certain people saying, hey, no, sorry, you're out of here, you can't do that. Or like, hey, no, we have it in our charter that when people start doing this sort of thing, they're out of the community, or whatever, right? But you need an institution in order to have those checks. And then, but then of course, then the other challenge is things can become too institutionalized. They can become ossified, dogmatic, start emphasizing orthodoxy, and basically just get stuck. So between those extremes, there's something that is really good and enriching and beautiful that can happen. But both of those extremes need to be known and appreciated, and we need to be aware of them. There are certain ways that an old friend of mine used to call these defects of quality. If a thing is beautiful for being red, just gloriously red and crimson, that is its quality. But then it's also not purple, right? And so it doesn't have the qualities that purple has, or some other color, right? So by its very being what it is, it has certain qualities, but then that's also a defect compared to something else. So when you have nascent spiritual communities, that lack of institutional framework can be a quality. It's exciting. It's there's momentum. There's new things. There's innovation. Stuff's happening. That's not the old stodgy institutional thing, right? That's not we tend to even think about that as a spiritual versus religious dichotomy. Oh, I'm spiritual, but not religious, right? And that basically means, oh, I'm interested in spirituality and what we would think of that, but I don't listen to like some institution that's going to tell me what to believe, or that I have to say some creed for, or what have you. So there's a quality there in the lack of institutionalization. But the defect is, okay, this gives some room for some bad actors. It gives some room for basically that very space creates an opening for, well, where are we going to go with this? And you could, argue vice versa. But I think that rather than thinking of these as either or situations, like, oh, well, we either it's, if we're going to do the spirituality thing, then that means it's going to go all these dark routes, and therefore we shouldn't do it. It's like, no, I think we need to appreciate that these are the stakes, these are the parameters, this is the field in which these things play out. And I think also one of the signs, telltale markers of sort of someone spiritually responsible, or a kind of teacher, we were talking about this and talking about teacherly authority, is someone who can spot these dangers, and hopefully be able to mediate and to moderate. And ideally, that's what an institutional framework is there to provide, is sort of people who have some vantage, some experience, and some are able to use that and leverage it to be able to, ward off the bad actors and the dark stuff that can happen, and further kind of cultivate the good stuff. I think that that's the best that institutions are for. Anyway, I'll leave that there. I think talking more about, I think, some of the specific downsides of past monastic, well, experiments would probably not be the right word, but monastic traditions, I think could also be an interesting, angle to take on.
I'm gonna actually put here something for the audience, because it is definitely something that I think everybody thinks of, which is essentially, the danger of cults. Right? I've been literally amassing amount, a very big amount of bibliography with respect to this, and I found this document called, it's a framework essentially. It's called the Advanced Bonowitz Cult Danger Evaluation Frame, and I'm gonna put it in a ticker underneath, so that people basically can go to that link. It's a PDF that I made, and essentially, it allows anyone to use these criteria to be able to evaluate whether they're in a cult. And it's really the best thing I found. And, I've read, like, Cults Inside Out by Rick Ross. I've read basically a number of particular case studies for Feet of Clay. I don't know if you've seen that. Is by I think his name is Anthony Storr, like an Oxford psychiatrist. She evaluated Osho and Gurdjieff and a bunch of others. But because these are long books, right? This is, I think, the most useful thing that someone can use to start saying, okay, what amount of internal control is being exercised here? How much dogma is there? Is there recruiting? Are there front groups? Is there some sort of sexual manipulation or favoritism happening? Is there censorship happening? Are they trying to isolate us from our family? One that I love is the criterion of grimness, amount of disapproval concerning jokes about the group, its doctrines and leaders. I think that's very interesting. So if you go to that link, you'll find literally 18 criteria that you can use to evaluate from 1 to 10 how much danger you're in. And I think that just so that we give something to the audience to start chewing on, this is the best thing that I found with respect to something easy that it will be easy for people to protect themselves. But it's a massive issue. It's a massive issue. And what's really bad about it is that it scares away people from spirituality, pretty much. And something else that I think needs to be said is how even the word itself has been it's not being used right. I'm just gonna basically say it as it is. When people hear of a cult, they immediately think of a destructive cult. But the truth is that a cult comes from the Latin cultus, which literally means cultivation and worship. And what worship means, if you go look into the etymology, it means the recognition of something that's worthy, the recognition of something worthy of reverence. And when people worship, what they do, they're in a community of people who recognize that there's something beyond themselves, usually, that is worthy of reverence, that is worthy as such. And that's where we get culture from. Culture comes from cultus. If you read basically the book Leisure, The Basis of Culture by Joseph Piper, I don't know if you're aware of it. It's one of the best basically books on leisure I've read. He makes that very explicit. And if you go down into the etymology of it and to realize that essentially culture, cultus, cult, they're interrelated, and it ultimately has to do with what is that we recognize as being worthy. The interesting sort of like realization when you go down that change is that we are already in cults all the time. If you're a human, there's not but there's no option. You're already in one cult. What is the nation state? What is a corporation often? Like the question is not whether you can be out of a cult. The real question is, what are good cults and what are bad cults? Because if you don't do that thing where you recognize something as worthy, it's not the act itself that is bad, is making a wrong choice as to what to worship that's bad, right? Because if you worship, for example, a destructive narcissist that leads you to a mass suicide, that is horrible, right? Clearly. But the act itself of recognizing something as being worthy, that is not bad. And this association that like cult equals like destructive cult, I think actually doesn't serve anyone. It's almost like saying like sex equals rape. No, it's not true. So I know it's very like controversial to even say this, but it has to be said, because the moment you start using the words the way that they should be used, that's fascinating. You see, you have birds coming. Are you related to Saint Francis of Assisi? Anyway, so the moment you start,
that was just my sweet. That's my sweet.
The moment you reclaim the original meaning of words, it becomes easier to pierce through the fog of propaganda that has happened with respect to key concepts. For example, like the word democracy. Everybody thinks that democracy is about majority rule and majority voting. It was never about that. Anyone who reads Aristotle knows that democracy was always, the distinction was that the use of lottery to choose the positions of power. Most people don't even know this. That, like democracy, what distinguished it was not you voting who do you think is the best. Because if you were to do that, that's aristocracy. You're voting for the best. That's what Aristotle said. No, democracy is when that doesn't happen at all, and you go by the assumption that everybody's equal. And if that's the case, the best way to essentially figure out who's to rule, according to the Greeks and the Athenians, was, okay, we're going to have a machine called a kleroterion. You can actually go to the museum in the Agora and see it. And we're going to use that to literally randomly choose among the equals the position of power. There were many considerations around that, and I don't want to diverge too much. Obviously, it was about avoiding corruption. It was about giving a chance to power to people who weren't popular. There was a lot of stuff. And it wasn't just that, even if you got selected, you immediately got placed in a position of power. There were safety checks. But I just want to go back to the original topic, which was the words that we use have a history. And if you dig down into that history, that's often a way to avoid or escape or pierce through the propaganda often around that, and discover a truth that may surprise you. Like, I didn't know that about cults. I learned it from a book, but I just found it fascinating that it actually wasn't a bad word originally. It was the community of people who shared a belief around what's worthy. How can that be a bad thing? Well, we just said how it was. Like, sometimes you choose wrong beliefs, but on its own, it's really not a bad thing. And as I said, like, we're already in cults, whether we're aware of it or not. So the question we need to ask is, let's basically create good ones.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. Jamie Wheel, I think, makes this same point in that book I mentioned, Meaning 3.0. I believe he talks about the need to create a healthy cults. But to your point, and to expand upon that a little bit, that's exactly right. I mean, cultus. I love. There's sort of this. There's a sort of. I don't know what you'd call it. It's an interplay of different associations and connotations with this word. So cultus means, as you say, in that kind of religious sense of, worship or something like that. But it also means it's also at the root of culture. So there's art, there's something about the aesthetic in there, and then also cultivation, as in the soil and the earth, and the if you allow all of those connotations to sort of swim together, I think that there's something highly monastic there, right? It's we come together in reverence about, you know, ultimate concerns and reality. We do so, of course, the monastic places, the monasteries were the preservers of culture, of course, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, and you have the manuscript, scribal tradition there. But also, I mean, the center of so much medieval art is, of course, also initially focused in the monastic areas, in terms of like for altars and things like that, which then, of course, gets taken up. And anyway, so cult in both senses. And then finally, they worked the land. You know, they were out there tilling the fields together and growing potatoes and vegetables. And there's something very beautiful and healthy about that. Now, what's unfortunate, as you say, is that cult as a word has now become so inextricably, I would say inextricably synonymous with bad cult. And this is a question I keep coming back to. I've had conversations with Layman Pascal about this. Is like, to what degree is it worth trying to reclaim words versus trying to, sort of just create new ones or something like that?
Maybe we should make like cults great again.
Say that again. I missed what you said.
It was like
make cults great again. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, like, it was like,
no, that's a good bumper sticker. Make cults great again.
Poking fun at basically, like, the Trumpian,
no, I heard you.
thing. But yeah, it's you're right.
Right.
It's not easy. It's not easy. And even just saying it, people.
But just to finish that thought,
they'll probably cut this clip and think that we're crazy, right? But tell me more about, like,
exactly, right. So there's a contextual problem. Oh yeah. So yeah, just to finish that thought. So there's an issue around language that needs to be handled there. And I would actually just throw in a couple more things there. One, well, okay, where do I want to take this? So if we think of that sort of triad as being important to, I think that those elements exist in a healthy cultic setting, let's say, a monastic setting. And I think that those would be great things to incorporate and to enculturate in neo-monastic contexts. Basically, worship of some kind, or transcendence, art, and permaculture, basically. And one of the things that's also very interesting about, we're all trying our best to save the world right now. And we really hope that one pans out. If it doesn't, there's an interesting and very also, I mean, you could call this the ultimate silver lining, right? This is sort of dark, but it's also true, I think, is that monastic communities were those spaces that were the repositories of culture in periods of dissolution and fray and transition. And so the more we can do to establish these sorts of safeguards of civilization, really, couldn't hurt. Hopefully that's a huge plan B there. But there's a notion that, one of the things that happened, obviously, when the Roman Empire collapsed was that, okay, now the cities are dangerous and inaccessible, et cetera, et cetera. But the monasteries were the places where people were growing food and living sustainably and preserving, knowledge, essentially. And so as Europe kind of bounced back from that collapse, it was around those monastic hubs that really began to take hold. And that's why the church dominated the medieval period, is because that was the cultural, center from which those things spread. So again, this is, in terms of taking things out of context, if there's two things to take away, it's that Brendan Dempsey loves cults and that he hopes that the world is going to end so we can all, no, that's not what I'm saying. But there's a reality in which, we don't know the kind of future that we're in for. And I find it a compelling notion that as we transition or try to transition towards healthy, sustainable networks, healthy, sustainable systems that are based in regenerative permaculture and permacultural design and those sorts of things, that basically those are the most anti-fragile sorts of systems that, should something terrible happen in terms of our networked culture that everyone is investing in faster than they can buy up Bitcoin and NFTs. If that thing doesn't pan out, the notion of having a robust anti-fragile network of culturally related, in all senses, regenerative kind of mini societies is an interesting one. I guess I would just say it was at the very least interesting enough that I thought, okay, in informing certain kinds of literary works that I was playing around with, I was sort of using that as sort of like, well, what would it look like if we did sort of transition away from our current form of organizational society into something more sustainable, and what if something like this was really the driver of it? So there's a way, I guess I'm just saying, in which monasteries, to sum this up, while they are also individual places for individuals to come and deepen and grow and expand their potentials for transcendence, they are also cultural in the broader sense. They tie individuals into broader communities. They are transmitters of knowledge, intergenerational knowledge. They are potential sort of frameworks, infrastructural frameworks based in regenerative and sustainable practices that could be meaningful for what our future societies look like. And I guess that's broadly the point I'm trying to make. If you strip it away of all the other extraneous, more apocalyptic sounding things that may have come across there, which wasn't obviously the point, but the cultural significance of monasteries. I guess I just wanted to bring that into that cultist point you were making.
No, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, I actually included one of the teaser decks that I'd created for the Monastery, made like exactly that point. Before going into that, I will actually say that what's really interesting is that the famous like cult expert Stephen Hassan actually did write a book called The Cult of Trump, with the subtitle "Leading Cult Expert Explains How the President Uses Mind Control," which I found like fascinating. I actually do have the book, so it's not as if like modern leaders don't actually use such techniques. And he's probably not the only one. Actually, definitely not the only one. So it's not a joke. Basically, I guess that's what I'm gonna say. We might joke about it, but it's not a joke for sure. And that's why I have the sticker underneath to kind of like remind people that it's a very serious thing, and you're gonna use those like criteria to actually figure out whether you're in danger. But that being said, I completely agree. In fact, with what you said earlier, like as monasteries being repositories of culture, and in one of my presentations, basically, like I was saying that maybe like these polysteries are, monasteries for those who live in the future, And in the deck, basically, I talked about how visionaries are often ahead of their times, misunderstood, ignored, and the worth of their work and efforts are only recognized like decades after their death. So what if there was a place that could go and their visions were supported and made available to the world like earlier? And instead of like having like people like Nikola Tesla like dying in a hotel, like completely like abandoned, you could have people who live in the future like go to these places, because the thing is that many of the forward-looking ideas just are so far off from the average that either they're not understood or they're very difficult to implement, right? So these people, when they try to actually implement or even think about those ideas, are finding it like very hard to actually like operate in society as is. So these monasteries or these polysteries could actually be the places where they go to find that safe haven and go deeper into those new like ideas, almost like a sort of cocoon from which they will like birth out like the new. And you're protected but you shouldn't stay there. But if you do, then you kind of ossify. So in some ways, like I was thinking that monasteries could be like a place where you go as a cocoon and then you come out with the new, rather than keep it in. Because obviously, like a lot of people do associate it with escapism and isolationism. Oh, I don't like society. Goodbye. I'm going to the monastery, right? And there are occult reasons why this is not the case, but I don't want to actually go on a tangent and talk about this. But I think that we can have new kind of monasteries where, I don't know if you know, originally like monastery meant monos zin. It comes from the ancient Greek, to live alone, and we don't have to live alone to be in a community of like seekers. In fact, like like the Buddhism, like in Buddhism, you had like the three sort of like pillars of Buddhism is like Buddha, the state, not the person, Shanga, the community, and then Dharma, the teachings. And I think it was this Thai Buddhist, which I'm horrible at pronouncing his name, but Thich Nhat Hanh, I can't pronounce it, that she basically said that he believes that the next Buddha is going to be a community. It's not going to be a person. So maybe like we can structure those new kinds of monasteries as like future Buddhas, where instead of like focusing on the individual, you focus on the collective. In fact, like my whole vision with respect to like how can we shift this like planet to a new sort of like level of consciousness, which I call Operation Numinous. You can check it at numinous.vision. Is the subtitle is Nurturing Collective Enlightenment, right? A lot of us like have had the the sort of like path, privilege, like luck, call it what you want, to go into practices where we get a taste of the divine, of enlightenment, call it what you want. But the thing is that this world will not change if like that is held in like tight silos and containers of privileged people. On the other end, like we have to acknowledge that it takes some time to be able to actually digest and recognize spiritual esoteric truths. I can't just go to a 3-year-old and start talking about quantum mechanics and get pissed off when he doesn't understand it, right? So just because you become an adult, that doesn't mean that you can understand everything that's esoteric and occult. So you may need to go to a place where you have the time, space, and guidance for you to do so. And these new monasteries could serve that. And not only that, but like teach you more about what it means to like evolve along a spiritual path. So in some way, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I understand that it is not like easy to talk about like esoteric things without any preparation, and like expect in this world of instant gratification that you'll understand everything like with the click of a button. You need to put in the work, but that work cannot be hiding perennially behind a sort of like moving goalposts when it comes to like spiritual truths and experiences. And I'm saying this because many like teachers often like manipulate that into like creating cults and whatnot. Whereas many teachers basically will say, look, if you do these like practices, you will have this experience. Maybe like you won't have the entire like experience, but you'll have a glimpse that's personal, that you don't need to rely on what I say for you to do this. And if there's one thing basically that like psychedelics like responsibly used sometimes like offer, is a glimpse into a mystery that is undeniable. And especially when it comes to like heroic doses, I'm not talking about recreational doses. And once you have that glimpse, it becomes like a target, because obviously like with psychedelics, very often you come back from that state of like union, bliss, whatever you want to call it, if you achieve like that kind of experience. But then that becomes a target, so you can actually start putting in the work, whether that's meditation or different modalities, so you can stay there longer, and even without the substances themselves. Because many people who don't have the patience, or like don't even believe that there's something at the end of a 5-year meditation practice, right? May actually find it easier for them to have a responsible, safe, and legal like psychedelic experience, for them to realize that the mystical domain is an experience that's undeniable once you have it, and it doesn't require like any authority or whatnot, because like it's everybody like has access to it, right? So when I say it has access to it, I don't mean that everybody can actually get access to the psychedelics as such. But what I'm saying is that it's the inheritance of our humanity. And if we had the institutions that would facilitate this revealing, as it was, for example, in other like times, like in ancient Greece, for example, you had the Eleusinian mysteries. Maybe like it will provide for the experience, the common experience that will facilitate discussions about who we truly are and what we're supposed to do here. Otherwise, often when you have experience like talks with like mystics that talk of other worlds, they sound like crazy. And then you have the experience and you realize, oh, they weren't crazy. Oh, this is actually real. But anyway, I don't want to like diverge too much. But I think that it should be at the core. It should be at the core of like these monasteries, that they get you to the place of experience where it makes sense as to why you're doing this entire thing, right? Rather than just following authority for like 20 years.
Yeah, I very much agree. I to pick up on a couple points there, which I liked a lot too, is that you mentioned that these monasteries or polysteries could be temporary. It's not like you're signing your life away for the next 50 years to go live in this place, right? So I think this is a meaningful distinction actually, and part of a way of parsing out like older traditional forms of monastic life versus what's possible now. So if you say in the old category, that was basically, yeah, you sign up and that's the rest of your life. And actually in practice, it was usually your family that signed you up. you were sort of, for whatever various reason, kind of given to the monastery, whether you wanted to go there or not. But that aside, anyway, you were then in there, so you show up at 16 or something and you'll die there, and you're waking up for the rest of your life at 4 a.m. and doing extreme training, which is in the Greek ascesis, which is where we get ascetic or asceticism. And this was a place of training. It was like, let's go live at the gym for the rest of our lives. And that's a pretty hardcore way to do that. So if you and then of course there's the whole thing of like, not only are you waking up super early and just training all day, there's no form of like familial or romantic, connection that really can be explored in the same way that people can outside the community. So you're cut off. You're a monastic. You're by yourself, etc. So I would say those are a bunch of things that I think we can eschew for at least certain kinds of these neo-monastic frameworks that we're talking about. And I think for all the better. And I think that what you're talking about is a temporary, you use it as a cocoon to sort of do some gestation or some kind of metamorphosis and then come back out into the world, I think is also really important, right? Because if all this stuff is just going on inside the monastery, how's it going to change the world? How's it going to get out? That sort of a thing. So one of the things that I'm really excited about is, we do in some ways already have a model kind of like that. And it is a retreat model. You go for a week, let's say, if you can, for longer, all the better. And the Hansi post that we mentioned at the outset was talking about doing this for a year, which I think would be really, really great. But anyway, I just wanted to emphasize that temporary component because I think it's important. And I think that you'd have sort of a broader expansion of these ideas into the general public if people realized it wasn't just this stratified, either or, well, I either am a monk or, I'm a lay person, but something that can more holistically fulfill, I think, what Luther was, I don't want to say trying to get at, but what when you hear the idea of, the priesthood of all believers, something like that, it's interesting because Vervaeke in some ways credits Luther with the destruction of the monastic tradition in the West. And I think that there's a lot to be said about that point. And so it's a kind of interesting balance how once you get rid of these hierarchical institutions, that you actually can wind up losing the entire thing that those institutions are trying to guard, and trying to find that delicate sweet spot. That balance is important. But anyway, temporary, whether that's a retreat style or whether that's, a year-long sort of thing. But then the question for me is, what's the curriculum? What's the setup? I think that there's a lot of people are grokking this general idea, right? It's like, yes, this sounds good. We need this. Let's do this. And okay, I'm in a position where it's really cool because I'm at a retreat center and I'm sort of I like the space is here, but then it's like, okay, how do we utilize this? And other people who have spaces, how do we utilize these spaces? How do we actually facilitate these learning environments, these growth experiences for people? Then there's a sort of, okay, narrowing in further. We've got to, I think, develop very real, concrete curricula, hopefully at least in concert with the person or people who are coming, who are looking for, there's got to be an exchange of, okay, where are you at? What are you looking for? It's not just a one size fits all. That's part of the failure of our kind of factory model industrial system of education, but like more of a mentor, more of a, what's the word? Sort of a tutor almost approach, more one-on-one and more something like that. Even if you're in a group, you're working with people individually to grow individually. I think that that's important. But again, we've got to get I'll say curricula. A curriculum sounds like one of those old stodgy institutionalized words, right? I guess, an even worse one would be catechism, right? It's like that, but that's really essentially what that was. So how do we loose the bonds of catechism and curricula so that they're actually, they work, that they're doing what they're supposed to do, the way that, like, okay, like my sister is a teacher, she has curricula because she's got students, and we're going to go over these things throughout the year, and that's how people progress and that's how people grow and develop. So it'd be great to have people more spiritually adept than I working on these sorts of things of like, okay, well, or doing some kind of syncretistic or synthetic work to be like, okay, I've been reading all these various people. Let's try to bring this together into some kind of thing. Again, talk to Bruce Alderman about this, about the idea of an integral curriculum, which I'm thinking is really interesting. This, of course, also ties into issues about, do we train people to be doing these sorts of trainings, right? Then you start getting into like, not just monasteries, but something more like a seminary context, or a, again, that was that context, the conversation I had with Bruce about sort of an integral seminary, but something about, we need people to facilitate this work, but it can't be all ad hoc. And I think Paul's comment earlier about the sort of spiritual modernist approach of sort of autodidacticism, throwing it all together, do what you want. That's what we need to avoid. But this gets us back to, well, we need enough structure so that we're avoiding that, but not too much structure that it gets stuck. So reiterating a lot here, but also hopefully trying to, zero in on what specifically is needed. What is the design challenge here that needs to be sort of met? I think those were the main points I wanted to make on that, other than, I'm with you, in all of this, and I'm excited by the prospects, and I think that, the last thing I wanted to say too is that, how do digital spaces fit into this, right? It's like, because this is one of the hardest elements about sort of a retreat going somewhere model, right? We've all got there's limited space and there's travel constraints and all this sort of stuff, not to mention, of course, COVID. So are there ways of doing this sort of work, on your own in a sort of monastic, way, in your own, still living at home and whatever, but still getting guidance and that sort of a thing, and yet not losing some of that communal dynamic and not losing some of that momentum that you get on an intentional, carving out space to do this sort of stuff? These are just to name some of the questions and the challenges, I think. But if we're able to home in on these particular things, and if enough people are working on these particular challenges, I think we're going to start to see an ecology of infrastructures popping up that are sort of doing these things. We already are in some ways, right? I mean, you can go to Costa Rica and other places to these retreat centers and participate in an ayahuasca ceremony with someone of shamanic lineage and things like that, right? How do we get more of that going on in other places? Legalities and other things becoming a complication there. Anyway, just throwing all that stuff out there, and also to say I probably need to pop off before too long, so we can have maybe some final reflections soon. But these are my favorite questions, and really important. So thanks for starting this.
Of course, I think these are very important questions. I agree, and in some sense, I don't think that it makes sense for these questions to be discussed like in isolation. I think what we're seeing, or what I feel is necessary, is to create what I call like fellowships of people who attempt those things, that belong into leagues that are around specific questions. So imagine basically that, let's take like the example like basketball, right? Each person belongs to a team, because obviously like, all these issues that you talk about are extremely difficult to answer or implement on one own. Like you can't, like there's just too much stuff, right? So each person can be part of a team that tries to execute on this. And there's many different teams, but we all belong on the same like league, where the intention is similar, which is how do we create spaces for spiritual development? What are like the new monasteries, the new polysteries, whatever you want to call them, that will facilitate spiritual development in the 21st century and beyond, and will avoid the mistakes of the past, will avoid current dangers like turning into cults or whatnot, and actually also deliver results rather than new dogmas, right? And I'm using basically dogma as distinct from like teachings, in the sense of connected to the regular use of dogmatic, right? So I think that that is a challenge, and I think that the only way to solve it is to have those different teams on a league to keep each other in check, right? And that's kind of like the stuff that, in fact, there's a lot of stuff that I'm working on that's very directly related to what we just said. It's just that I haven't posted them yet. But with respect to something that you said about the retreat spaces that you have, that you're in, I know you have like an upcoming retreat as well. I don't know if you want to talk about it, but I will mention that after my grant period was over, I did basically try and I founded this attempt called the Evolving Caravan, where what we decided to do is, I said, okay, maybe what we need to do is we need to create a new Silk Road for spiritual and consciousness revolution, right? And what we'll do is we'll create a team of people and start visiting potential places that could turn into polysteries. And I put together like a team of like 16 speakers, and we did this tour throughout Europe. We went to like London, we went to like Amsterdam, we went to Lisbon, Paris, Munich, Davos, Zurich. And in each place, we met with a person that was working on these issues. We met with Peter Fenwick, we met with Rupert Sheldrake, or we met with a number of people in the different places we went to learn from them, but to also kind of like create this new map. And at the same time, we had these like events that were temporary, that included both lectures and workshops. Like we had holotropic breath work, we had all sorts of stuff to just give a taste. So it was essentially like a moving monastery, a moving polystery. That's what it was. And I at the end of the first one, I basically like moved on to other things, but it did like continue into like 2 or 3 more runs. Maybe it's still around. I went to Asia and I went to Europe again. But the reason why I mention it is because we need to start connecting those places, those retreat spaces, those new monasteries, those old monasteries, and essentially talk about these new ideas. Because I think that many people that are even running what would be called legacy monasteries, I'm pretty sure are like thinking about like today and how they can change or evolve or be relevant with young people and like modern people or meta modern people, and could be part of the conversation. Could be part of the conversation. And if we can't create like one space, physical space, maybe we can like go to different places physically, or we can create one that's digital, and then you invite those people to zoom in from those places, and you create those polysteries online. I now do have the technical infrastructure to be able to host stuff like that, like massive like webinars and massive conferences. So maybe we can do one together and like test it out. Especially if it's digital, especially now with like COVID, it will be much easier than organizing like something like physically. So I think that's a nice note to end it, given that you need to go. But I do want to give you the opportunity to say like some last comment. But before you do so, I want to thank you for coming to this like live stream, and for doing the work that you do. I may not comment very often in your group, but I do actually follow it. And I think the work that you're doing there is very valuable. So I just wanted to say that before we close, and then give it to you so you can actually like say some things before you go.
Well, thank you so much, both for this is great. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I feel like we're just starting to get into it and break the ground, and there's so much more to explore there. So yeah, here's to more of this. Thanks for the words. I appreciate that too. But also I love all the stuff that you're talking about is great. So by all means do share and post stuff, because I'd love to see and know more about what you're up to. It sounds like the sort of stuff that you're working on is super just totally entwined and overlaps with what I think of as meta modern spirituality. So whether that is posting stuff in the group, or as you say, maybe doing some kind of collaborative thing, totally open to that, and we can go offline and talk about that sort of stuff too. But just wanted to say that. So thank you. I think some of the things you thought or mentioned there, I thought were really great. I love the idea of being able to have some kind of basic structure that maybe is mobile in some way. I love the idea of having something that is potentially sort of totally online, so that something like that very structure is, kind of shareable in a intentional context where people come together. So that puts the onus off of travel and that sort of thing. I love the idea of like a pilgrimage network of sorts, like sort of meta modern pilgrimage network where people are kind of moving in sort of a, not even a monastic at that point, but more like a mendicant really would be the model there of mendicant, almost like mendicant friars or something, or itinerants, going around and preaching their jolly meta modern spiritual insights to people that, anyway. So all that is super cool and exciting. I actually wrote a piece, maybe I'll send it to you, when I was working on, I briefly started working on well, for about, I don't know, a summer, was working on converting a school bus into a tiny house that I was thinking of as my mobile monastery. Actually, I called it Abbey for that purpose. And I was going to go around and sort of, live this sort of Dharma bum like existence and preach meta modern spirituality, whatever that means. But anyway, that none of that panned out. But those sorts of things I'm super interested in. I love the potential overlaps though with people who are doing those sorts of things, tiny house communities and DIY, regenerative homestead people. I don't know. There's a lot of opportunity there. I'm just sort of spitballing out at this point, but it's super exciting. And then lastly, the idea of networking these spaces that already do exist. Like I'm deeply fascinated and interested in Alex Gray's community, which I have not yet had the chance to visit. Well, was going to go out there and then COVID hit and they shut down. But like, I think that's about 6 hours away from here in Wappinger Falls. Like places like that, and doing other seeing those sorts of things pop up and be networked in a meaningful way. So there's some intercourse and inter exchange of ideas and people. All that's super exciting.
Well,
Finally,
well,
there is a retreat
yeah,
going
talk about
down
the retreat.
on. Oh, okay. Yeah, just real quick, I'll just mention there is a retreat going down here. So my retreat center is called Sky Meadow Retreat. It's not mine. I'm the caretaker, sort of the host. And I live here. And currently it's just me and my partner, Aaron. But I'm really excited to try to bring this sort of stuff to this space. And so my first attempt to do that is this retreat that's happening in May of 2022, May 13th to the 15th. Layman Pascal, brilliant, wonderful, charismatic, wonderful human being, is going to be doing a bunch of talks. But then also Greg Enriquez will be here and Bruce Alderman. So people from sort of the meta-modernist and integral community and, people exploring meta theory and stuff. And we're going to see what that looks like. I'd love to see if it some of that coheres, comes together. It's an experiment. But if it works, I'd love to be doing these regularly, whether that's like a spring and a fall or something like that. And then maybe potentially something more long term. So anyway, if you go to my website, BrendanGrahamDempsey.com, there's a retreats tab there, and there's some info if people are interested in that. It's limited. I think we have about 12 more seats available for that if people do find themselves interested. And yeah, but so let's continue the conversation at some other point and keep talking and connecting, because this is great. So thank you very much.
Well, I put both the Sky Meadow Retreat for a bit at the ticker, and I put your website right now so that people can actually go to that. Ooh, and on top of that, I think I'll end by saying that this network of people that you talk about. Well, I don't know if you saw like the last thing that I launched in the last full moon on December 18th, but essentially the new launch of the Lysios is about launching and like hosting a socio-technical infrastructure for coordinating global awakening and facilitating universal flourishing. And one of the projects underneath, which is in the second slide if you go to Lysios.com, is essentially a directory of professionals, retreats, and so forth. Now, I'm saying this because I've already built it. Right now, basically, if you go to directory.Lysios.com, like you see just like a landing page to generate leads, but I've actually built, I've used a SaaS product to create the directory, and within the next few weeks, I'll actually like reveal it. But I'm gonna start inputting all those places, right? And all the kinds of people who are trying to offer such services, and people can claim their profiles so they can get leads and stuff like that. But I just wanted to mention that I am aligned with what you say, and in fact, I've already built the infrastructure for something like that. And I'd be more than happy to talk more on either privately or like even like other live streams on how do we facilitate all the stuff that we spoke of, and co-create something that we can all be proud of and helps the world, become a better place. All right. Well, thanks again for this chat, and looking forward to like future conversations. All right. Goodbye.